Hello everyone, Gabe here from homestudioengineer.com and toastandbananas.com, and I wanted to make the first official video on this YouTube channel about compression. At this point, it probably goes without saying that compression is one of the most misunderstood, misused, and challenging aspects of audio production for people, especially when we're first starting out. And it's made even more difficult because even after you understand what compression is, how it works, it's not always easy to figure out how to get it to work the way you think it should. But this video is going to hopefully break all that down in an easily understood format. But before we jump into it, I've written a free guide called The Simple Guide to Compression that covers everything we're going to talk about in this video and then some. You can download it for free at the link in the description, and you can keep it as a quick reference guide. Very easy to read, but also very thorough, so be sure to grab that. But to start, let's define what compression is. And the technical definition of compression is the reduction of dynamic range. But really, that's just a fancy way of saying that compression makes the difference between the quiet parts of a track and the louder parts smaller. So to visualize that, let's take a look at this waveform that I've got in front of me. In certain sections of the waveform, you'll see the little blobs or the little bumps are smaller. But over here, the blobs are larger. And that obviously represents the volume of the track. So this area is obviously louder than this smaller section here. Now the difference in volume between the quietest part and the loudest part is the dynamic range of this track. Well, imagine that you've recorded this track and it sounds good, but in this section here that I've got highlighted, it's too quiet. But once you get over here, it's too loud. What that means for us is, we can't just go over here and set our volume fader to a certain point and have that work, because if we turn it up to make this section here louder, it's going to make this section that's already too loud, even louder, and vice versa. If we turn this down, it's going to make this quiet section even quieter. So compression is one of the ways that we can go about fixing this problem. We can reduce the dynamic range. We can reduce the difference between this quiet part and this louder section here to make it so that we can find a volume setting that'll be good for the entire track. So another way to think of compression is that compression is just the process of automatically adjusting the volume of a track to make it more even and consistent. No parts too quiet, no parts too loud. And that's really all it is, which is pretty simple. Okay, so the concept is simple, but what do all of the knobs and settings mean? Let's pull up a basic compressor here. I'm going to pull up the one that comes stock with Pro Tools, this one here, because it's a good example. And now this is where people can start to become lost, myself included for a long time. People can understand what compression is and why we might want to use it, but how the heck do we get these knobs to actually achieve that? So let's break them down one by one in simple terms. So first up is threshold, and that's this knob here, or it's controlled on this compressor by this little triangle. And the threshold is a volume setting that tells the compressor when to start working. So if I move this little triangle up and down or use that thresh knob, you'll see this thresh setting change, and it's listed in dB. So if we set this to be, I don't know, minus 10.4 dB, that means that whenever the volume of the track that we're trying to compress, which in this case is this vocal track, whenever the volume of that track exceeds minus 10.4 dB in volume, the compressor will start to work. It'll start to compress the audio. And we'll talk more about the specifics of that in a second, but just know threshold tells the compressor when to start working. At what volume do we want it to start working? So next up is ratio, which is right here. And now this is pretty closely related to threshold. If the threshold tells the compressor when to start compressing, this ratio knob is going to tell the compressor how much to start compressing. So you'll see that it's set to 3:1 right now, which is a very common default setting. But we can move this to whatever we want. This one goes all the way up to 100:1. Some go to 20:1, 50:1. Doesn't really matter. They all work the same. But what does this mean? And it might sound a bit tricky at first, but it's actually really simple. It just takes a second to think about it. A 3:1 ratio means that for every 3 dB that the volume of our track goes over our threshold, the compressor will reduce that to just 1 dB of audible volume. So using the example that we have, if our threshold's set to -10, for every 3 dB that our signal goes louder than -10 or -10.4 in this case, we'll actually only hear 1 dB of that. Same thing if we set the ratio to 10 to 1 or 50 to 1 or whatever. With a 10 to 1 ratio, for every 10 dB over threshold, the compressor lets 1 dB of that be audible. So the higher the ratio, typically the more compression you're getting. Now, don't worry if you don't understand all of the technicalities behind that, if you don't understand the mathematics behind it. It takes a bit for it to set in. It's more important that you learn how it's going to affect the audio, what it's going to sound like. So let's play this vocal on loop here, and I'll move the threshold around and the ratio so that you can kind of see or hear how it's affecting the audio. So I'll put the compressor in bypass first, and then we'll turn it on.
Wake up in the morning when I want get out of bed, can't find school if I play dead, hear mom screaming overhead, get out of bed, someone's coming up the stairs, I play dead, wake up in the morning.
So you can see that as we move the threshold around, the lower that we put our threshold, or the higher this number is, the more compression that we're getting. And as we adjust the ratio knob, the exact amount of gain reduction that we're getting, the exact amount of compression changes. So you can see how the ratio and the threshold go hand in hand. So the best way to learn is to experiment with it. So pull up a compressor on a piece of audio, mess around with the threshold, mess around with the ratio, and you'll start to kind of see how it all works. So next, let's talk about attack and release. And the attack setting, which is right here, it tells the compressor how fast to start compressing the audio once it goes above the threshold. So think of it as telling the compressor how fast to grab onto or attack the audio once it gets above your threshold setting. Similarly, the release, which is just below it on this compressor, that tells the compressor how fast to stop compressing the audio or to let go of it after it started to compress it. So a faster attack will compress the audio sooner, and a slower attack will let more of the audio come through uncompressed. A fast release will stop compressing the audio sooner, whereas a slow release will hold on to it and continue compressing it for longer. So again, the best way to start understanding this is to see how it actually affects the audio and use your ears. So let's play that section again and mess around with the attack and release.
Wake up in the morning when I want get out of bed, can't find school if I want, I play dead, hear mom screaming.
So here we have our attack set at the fastest and our release set at the slowest, which means that it's grabbing onto the audio and compressing it super quickly, and it's hanging on to it for a while to let go of that audio and stop compressing it. So we're getting very aggressive compression here. You can see it and hear it when you look at the gain reduction meter. So let's listen to that. Now let's see what happens when we do the opposite, when we make the attack the slowest and the release the fastest. You should see that we'll get a very subtle amount of compression here, or a much more subtle amount of compression in comparison.
Wake up in the morning when I want get out of bed, can't find school if I want, I play dead, hear mom screaming.
So we're really just catching a couple peaks here and there with those settings. So attack and release, you kind of have to experiment with to see what works best with the audio track that you're trying to compress. So the last setting that we'll talk about is the gain knob, which in this case it's right here, or you might see this called makeup gain or output. And it's really, really simple. The gain knob is just a volume knob, and it lets you make the overall signal louder. So think about it like this. When you compress an audio track and you turn down those louder parts, your overall signal gets quieter. So this gain knob lets you add volume to that now compressed signal. So this is what we mean when we say that a compressor can make the quiet parts louder, because it lets us add volume to those quiet parts without those super loud parts getting even louder because we're compressing those. So let's just listen to that. We'll add a little bit of gain to this vocal.
Wake up in the morning when I want. Get out of bed, get out of bed. Can't bunk school if I want. I play dead.
So as you could hear, we were able to add a pretty substantial amount of volume there. And that's pretty atypical. In most cases, if you're not sure where to put your gain setting, a good rule of thumb is to try to match the input and the output. So if you're getting, minus 12 on the input, after you compress it, you might get down here closer to minus 18. So we could add in a few dB of gain to get it back up to minus 12 so that we're not losing overall volume. But that's just a general rule of thumb. The gain setting can be anything you want, whatever suits the song. So let's take a second to review all the settings that we just talked about. We've got threshold, which tells the compressor when to start compressing. We've got ratio, which tells the compressor how much to compress. We've got attack and release, which tells the compressor how fast to start and stop compressing. And then you've got the gain setting, which allows you to add volume to the compressed version of the signal. What happens if you pull up a compressor that looks like this right here? This compressor really only has two main knobs. It has this gain knob and it has this peak reduction knob. This knob here just changes what we see displayed on this VU meter. Now, sometimes you might see this as input and output, but the concept is still the same. What this means is that all of the other settings that we talked about, threshold, ratio, attack, release, all that is fixed and it can't be changed. And that's why you might hear a compressor like this, which is an LA2A, called a fixed threshold compressor, because we can't adjust the threshold, nor can we adjust the attack, release, ratio, and all that. So how do we get these compressors to work if we can't make all those adjustments? Well, instead of adjusting the threshold to suit our audio, we have to adjust the audio volume until it starts to exceed whatever the threshold of this fixed threshold compressor is. That's why we have this gain knob. We're able to turn up the volume of our audio track until it exceeds the threshold. So essentially, to use a compressor like this, we set our gain setting to what feels right, and then we're able to use this peak reduction knob to adjust how aggressive the compressor is, how much gain reduction we're actually getting. So this should be a pretty good setting as far as our gain goes. I know we're exceeding the threshold. So let's experiment with this peak reduction knob and see how that affects the audio.
Wake up in the morning when I want. Get out of bed, get out of bed. Can't bunk school. I play dead. Hear mom screaming overhead.
So as you can see, these compressors fundamentally work the same way, but they simplify a lot of the controls by only giving you some of them. So again, with a fixed threshold compressor, you turn the gain or the volume of the track that you're trying to compress up until it meets the threshold of the compressor, and then you can tweak how much gain reduction you get from there. Now remember, in some cases, these knobs might be labeled something different. It might be input and output. You might not have a peak reduction feature. You might just have a makeup gain feature. It all kind of depends. There are tons of different compressors out there, but just know that the fundamentals behind them are all the same. All right, so that was a bit of a crash course in compression, how compressors work, how to use them. If you haven't already, please be sure to download the free guide at the link in the description. It talks about everything that we just covered in quite a bit more detail. It talks about different compression techniques, all sorts of stuff. So you can download that to have as a quick reference. But if you have any questions at all about anything that we covered in this video, please leave a comment or send me a message. There are a bunch of links in the description that take you to my social media, all that good stuff. You can check it out. Message me on there, whatever you need. If you have suggestions for future content, things you might want to see, might want to learn about, or if you have suggestions on how I should go about talking about some of these things, I'm all ears. Please leave me a comment, send me a message. But with that, I'll leave you to it, folks. Thank you all so much for watching, and take care.